Hello and welcome to another video in our How Do I Do Something in CloudBolt video series. My name is Mike Bombard. I'm one of the cloud architects on the pre-sale side of the house here at CloudBolt. And today we're going to be walking through how do I use parameters in CloudBolt. So let's just set a little background to this before we get into the technical portion of the video. So the business value here behind this video and what we're trying to solve with parameters inside of CloudBolt, really the big challenge kind of centers around ITSM processes and really metadata for the resources that we're trying to provision. So ITSM dictates that we need to capture certain information from our end users that we may need to use to drive things like tagging processes or enter different information into our ITSM systems of record. CloudBolt, the way that we approach this is with a component that we call parameters. And parameters are an extremely flexible way to capture different points of metadata. So the end user, when they go through submit a request, they may make a selection from a drop-down list. We might have a parameter value tagged somewhere, maybe at their group level or on their user profile. All of these different pieces of metadata can be aggregated as we submit that request to really intelligently drive what the actual value for a given parameter should be for a given user, group, environment, blueprint inside of CloudBolt. So we're going to walk through all of that. A part of this video will get into generated parameter options, which is a really powerful way to actually, why don't we just go and cover the agenda here? But this is what we're going to be covering as part of this video. We're going to talk about just parameters in general. We're going to start talking through what are parameters, what are parameter values, because although they are very related, they are two very different things. So we'll talk through that. We'll start then going into global parameters, talking about how do we set defaults and constraints around parameter values. Things like parameter propagation. So it's important to understand the order of operations inside of CloudBolt, how these parameters, if we're setting parameter values at different levels inside of the system, how they all interoperate, and then how the end user then interacts with those parameter values when they go to submit a request. We'll talk about the difference between environment, blueprint, user, and group parameters and the best times to use each of these constructs. We'll also go into generated parameter options, and we're going to be writing some code here, so we'll get into my development environment. We'll go through and walk you through how to generate options. And it could be something where it's as simple as we're creating a quick drop-down list of the user can select from these values, and it's hard-coded into a Python module. But a lot of times, this generated parameter options will be used for things like querying an external system like your ITSM system. Then a lot of this with ServiceNow, where our customers need to query a specific ServiceNow table to get values from that table, and then maybe they need to filter those values based off of the user account. And we can do all of that with a generated parameter options plugin, where we would reach out to ServiceNow at the time of order, pull in all of that information from the table, and then the user can select from the list of generated options that were returned from that ServiceNow table. So we know that they're always getting the most up-to-date information when they're submitting a request form from CloudBolt directly from the ITSM system of record. So we'll also talk about parameter dependencies. In CloudBolt, we can either regenerate options, meaning if we have a controlling field, maybe field A controls field B, whenever I change the value selected for field A, I can regenerate the options for field B and give a different drop-down. So these are dynamic drop-downs based off of different fields that may point to one another. We'll cover that because I do a lot of that when I work with customers, as well as like show hide generated parameter options. So we'll dig into that. And then to close out, we'll talk through action inputs, which are very similar to CloudBolt parameters, but they're a little unique in that they are they're tied to a specific CloudBolt plugin. So we'll talk through that, how to create those. And then we'll look at server parameters and resource parameters and just talk through that a little bit and how we might use those as part of automation. That could be something like a Boolean value where maybe this Boolean value says, do you want to back up this server? If they say yes, then we will kick off an automation process to go out and actually back up the server for them. Things along those lines, and just talk through how you can get to those values, how you can use those values in your automated processes. just to make your environment a more robust production environment that's fully automated. So, yeah, that's about the what we're going to cover today. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so parameters, to get to parameters and edit and create new parameters for the CloudBolt system, you can create parameters, and they need to be created in a global fashion inside of CloudBolt. So to create a new parameter, you can either go to all admin and get the parameters from there, or you can hit the parameters drop down from your admin menu here. Once we get to the parameters menu, you'll see a lot of different values. Some of these are out of the box parameters that we've created. In my environment, since this is my dev environment, a lot of these are things that I've created as I've built out new automations or attempted to capture additional information that I needed to do for a proof of concept with a customer, or just building different types of automation. But we have in CloudBolt, we have parameters and we have parameter values. A parameter allows us to build a brand new, and I'm just going to build a new parameter here. Why don't I call this, let's just create something. I think cost center is a common parameter we might capture from a customer. And there's a couple of ways that we can get at this information. So maybe we'll talk through this and maybe some of the examples here. I am going to namespace this with CB underscore. Actually, you know what? I'm going to namespace this with MB underscore because I probably have other things that are namespaced with CB underscore. When you're leveraging parameters in your environment, it's helpful, and sorry, I'm even in the wrong field here. It's helpful to prefix your parameter names with something that tells you that this is a parameter that is unique to your environment. The big reason for this is if I ever want to find all of the parameters that I've created in my instance, and exclude the out-of-box parameters, I can just type in MB underscore, and then I see all the parameters that I've created inside of this namespace. Just kind of a way to organize the way that we're doing things in the system. The next thing I'm going to do is give this a user-friendly label. So I'm going to call this cost center. The end user, when they interact with these parameters, are going to see the label, but under the covers, we're going to reference it as MB cost center in the database. You can put whatever description you want here. This is an optional field, and what happens is if we're using this parameter in a request, this ends up as a tooltip for the end user. So kind of you see these tooltips here. The end user would see that for your parameter where they can hover over this. So a good description is pretty important when you're creating parameters. That way the end users, when they activate with it. So why don't I follow my own advice? Please select your cost center. We could then also have a placeholder, and a placeholder could be a simple, maybe we use 6-digit cost centers. A placeholder could be like that, or maybe we just want to, this is going to be a ghosted value in the field that doesn't actually let the user take the value, but it shows them what this value should look like. So let's do a placeholder there just to show what that looks like. And then I'm going to create this as a certain type. I do a lot of strings here, but we also have other options available like an integer, an IP address, date and time, multi-line text, encrypted text. Each of these different types have different ways that we're storing this information for this parameter inside of the database as a parameter value. So, and there's also some validation that we add to this out of the box. Like if we're querying the end user, we're asking them to input an IP address here, we're going to validate that what they input is a valid IP address. So we'll do some of that validation just by selecting the type here. But like I said, a lot of times I'm going to do a string or an integer. Actually, you know what? Since this is going to be the cost center, we may have zeros to prefix things. So integer is probably not the best selection here because 006,000 is going to end up being just 6,000. It's going to be missing 2 of the numbers there. So I am going to select a string here. I'm going to make this required. Now, a required parameter and an optional parameter, if I make this required here, it's going to be required across the CloudBolt system. If it's not required here, it could be optional in the different contexts that we're going to use it in the system. Most of the time, I'm going to make this required, not always. One of the things that I always point out with a parameter that is a required parameter, If we add a single value for this parameter in the context where it's being used, the user will only ever see, or no, excuse me, they won't ever see this parameter input, because we're assuming that because it's required and there's a single value, that we're always going to take that selection. So this is something to keep in mind, that if you need the user to, if you want to predetermine what the value is going to be, you can just place a value, a single value for that context where we're using it. We'll get a little more into that as we go through this. The other thing that I'll point out here, so required talks about that, show on objects. So show on objects, when we look at different components in the CloudBolt system, say a server, when we go to a server in CloudBolt, same for other resource types, but when we look at a CloudBolt server, we can go over to the server object itself, and there's a parameter tab that shows up. And from that parameters tab, we can see these values here. Now, in your environment, you may not want the user to see this JSON payload. So we can mask that. A lot of times I'll leave this in my development environment. I'll leave this set as show on objects true, so that I can validate that I'm capturing the right values for this. But when we get to the production environment, I may opt to disable that show on objects, because we don't want the user to see something. They may also, if they have the appropriate roles, which you want to be careful of here, they can change these values. And if you want this to be read-only metadata, you can remove, I believe it's like edit parameters, permissions on the role. But you want to be careful with this, because I could come in here and edit this value with the way that this is set up currently. If you don't want your user to be able to edit these parameters, you don't want to select the show on objects unless your roles are set up appropriately. I'm also going to, let's come back to available to all servers, but show as attribute is similar to show on objects, except when it is shown as an attribute, it will show up on the details tab of the server here. This allows you to control, and as show as attribute is going to be a read-only field that shows on this main page here. Actually, I have some, take a look at some S3 buckets, I think would be a good example. But as a resource type themselves, we have some of these S3 buckets out here in my environment. Here's my resource. This resource has, apparently I lied, it does not have the parameters that I thought it would show as a value. But when they're set as show as attribute, they'll show on that main page. What I would be careful of here is you don't want everything to show as an attribute. You only want this to be information that the end user needs to be able to see when they're interacting with their resources. You don't want to show that too much, because what ends up happening then is that page gets cluttered and it just doesn't look good. It's not a good user experience. So, okay, back to available to all servers. The parameter will be available on the parameters tab of all servers. And that just means that if we have, I think we can do it from a resource as well, but let's go back over to our server example. That just means that from the parameters tab of a server, backups would be a good example of this, where you might have a parameter that determines that the server has a backup on it. And maybe when we first build this server, the user didn't select that, but if it's available to all servers, it will show in this list from an existing server to be able to add that parameter. Expiration date's a great example of this, where maybe the environment doesn't include an expiration date, but I could add an expiration date here to my server. And then, so here's where the parameter and parameter value starts to interact. This would be the value for the parameter when I want it to expire. And in my environment, I have a default set for expiration date, where the default is 6 months away from the date that we determine. And this would always start there, and then the user can change this value if we want them to be able to change it. You can also not add a default here, and that would work as well. So yeah, so adding that in, that option to make it available to all servers, would allow anybody with the rights to view and work with parameters to be able to add an existing parameter and a corresponding value to an existing server. So this isn't used quite as much, just because a lot of times the parameters we're using, it's used during like the initial provisioning workflow. So, you know, in that case, these parameters probably aren't necessary for some of those other values. Allow multiple values. this would allow us to pass in a list of different values. So I could select for a cost center, maybe we need to split the cost, and we can pass in 2 cost centers and it would split the cost evenly, something along those lines. Yeah, so those are kind of the options when we create a new parameter. I'm just going to leave this as required, and I'm going to go ahead and do show on objects for now. We're going to create this new parameter. We now have, I already have another cost center parameter in here, but we now have a cost center parameter. Once we've created it, all of those initial options are available here. Quick toggles, back and forth if we need. We can also get back to the edit screen to see some more advanced options. You still have your initial couple of selections. You cannot change the type, at least through the UI, after it's been created. And that's typically because we've already captured values on some objects, and this would really cause some havoc in the database if we allowed that. But you can also add some constraints from here now. So minimum length for my string, minimum length is going to be 6, maximum length is going to be 6 in our case because we want it to be 6 zeros, or 6 numbers, a 6-number string. So they're going to have to input at least 6 characters and no more than 6 characters. So adding validation into the way that we're capturing this parameter. We can also place a regex constraint around this, where I could go through and say that we're going to allow up to 6 characters with any numeric value in there. I am no regex wizard. I usually just end up Googling 6-digit number regex and test with a couple of things and find the best one. And then formatter pattern, you can come up with a pattern to show how to format any decimals, things along those lines. These aren't really applicable in this particular use case, but we've set up a couple of constraints now, and you'll start to see that the constraints also show on the right-hand side. So there's a couple of things going on the right-hand side of this parameter definition here. Number one is global defaults. Global defaults are handy in the case of you have a scenario where you always need to add a parameter for a specific use case. And these are usually, so cost center, maybe we always want to add a cost center of 01000. Anytime that we see a server come through, we could also do this to resources or all objects that we don't have to do an OS family, but an OS family is one of the ones that I usually see the global value done for. And this might be done for my Windows servers. I think there's an out-of-the-box parameter in CloudBolt that automatically sets the Windows server password to some value. And what we'll do is we'll search for server objects, and then we'll filter that for all Windows servers. And then based off of this, even if this parameter is not on the environment, the group, the user, anywhere that has to do with our request, this value will get added to those servers that meet this criteria. So if you have a process that's specific to Windows, and it always has to happen for Windows, or vice versa for Linux, or for CentOS or Red Hat, whatever that OS distribution is, this global parameter value is a really good option to always set it. Just keep in mind that even if you're not thinking about it, this value will hit those servers that meet this criteria. So I'm going to cancel out of that. Global options are handy if we want to do a drop-down list. So very basic drop-down list. If I want to say, that maybe that's one option, and then this is a different option, and then this is a third option. Now my end user will see these 3 parameter values from a drop-down and be able to select from those. I'm going to leave this like this for now, because as we work through this, we'll see how this interacts in different contexts inside of the system. So there's some global options that we've set now, so I should see those 3 options. Now, with these being global options, when we start to talk about propagation, I cannot set any options that are not, at least in the global scope, at a lower level. So keep that in mind. I can not set global options and then set options maybe on my environment or my group might be a better place to set those options. We'll talk through that in a minute. Programmatically generated options, we'll come back to this. This is the ability to use a CloudBolt plugin to generate options. We also have some environment and group constraints, but to do that, we'll have to go to individual environments and individual groups to set those constraints. And we'll head over there in just a minute. Dependencies, that has to do typically with programmatically generated options, but talking about maybe dynamically displaying a field or hiding a field, or also leveraging a different field to add a different value. So now that we've defined this parameter, what we can do is we can go and define on an environment or a group, these are the constraints for this environment. So why don't we start there? We go over to, so this cost center, let's say that I have a couple of environments here. So let's just take a very basic server use case where I am, let me find a good environment to clone. Okay, I'm gonna grab just my basic one. Here's my basic environment. I'm going to clone this so that I'm not impacting anything that I'm already doing with this environment. Give it a different name. These environments are really logical abstracts for my vCenter, or really any of your cloud accounts. They allow us to constrain access to tighter regions of your cloud accounts that we've plumbed into. In VMware, that's the idea of a VMware cluster. So every environment in CloudBolt for vCenter points at a single cluster. It enables us to control whether certain users can access certain clusters inside of the system. So, but we can go to this. First of all, let's talk about vCenter parameters or resource technology parameters. Resource technology parameters are something that CloudBolt controls. This is built into our source code. And every resource handler has their own specific parameters that are applicable to that system. For vCenter, it's pretty simple. There's 3 of them. I'm just going to go through and import all of the values here afresh. And what it does is it will go out and it will talk to my vCenter cluster, find out what data stores are connected, what disk provisioning types are available, and any resource pools that may be available, so that we can give the end user, we can either give them the option to select from a couple of different ones, or we can constrain down, again, that idea of a single value, because these parameters are still at their face value a CloudBolt parameter. Now you won't see these in the normal parameters menu from the admin dropdown, but I could go into the parameter from an environment, and I could edit some of these things. I'd be careful with that because you can impact the behavior of the system. But these are CloudBolt parameters at their base value. So, but usually the way that we work with these is I'm going to go in and constrain a user to only see the things they should see. In the case of my VMware data store, I don't want them to be able to see anything except for this CB Nimble data store cluster. I don't want my end users picking from individual data stores. I don't want them using this ISO storage data store cluster. I always want them to use CB Nimble. I can now save this, and I now know that anytime a user uses this sales parameters environment, they're always going to get placed on this CB Nimble data store, and the end user will never see this selection on the input form because they don't need to know this information. Most of our end users don't understand what the data store is and really have no business making that kind of a determination either. So that's an easy way to constrain that. I'm also going to do the exact same thing for disk provisioning type, where my policy for my environment is that these are always going to be thin provisioned VMs. So I can set this once for an environment and move on with life. I don't ever have to think about this again. And now we've taken away the choice from the end user here by selecting that single option on a mandatory required field. The other thing I'm going to do, I don't really do a ton with resource pools, so I'm going to remove this from the environment altogether. I want all of my resources to end up in the root resource pool. So I can remove some of these resource technology parameters. Not all of them are applicable for removal, but if it's something that's kind of optional inside of the system, like resource pools aren't always required in VMware, usually it's safe to remove that parameter altogether from how we're building this environment out. The next thing that I'm going to go to is from an environment, we have these parameters, and these are not specific to our resource technology, so these don't have anything to do with VMware per se. Some of these are driving VMware, like my server size selection, which is a pre-configuration, which is actually a collection of parameters in CloudBolt, which is really handy. In this case, I'm using it to do t-shirt sizing, but we may have a number of different parameters and values that we want to tie together, where we give the user a single selection, and based off of that, we're writing 4 different parameter values to that resource. So these pre-configurations are really handy. We're not really going to go super deep there on this video because it's outside of our scope. So, okay, parameters. There's a couple in here like expiration date. Quantity is another interesting one that is an out-of-the-box parameter that would allow you to say, I need, in this case, I've constrained them to selecting 1, 2, or 3 servers for this environment. I don't want them to do any more, any less. This is actually a drop-down menu here. I didn't put constraints on it, but we could also remove the options and give the user a constraint here. So there's a couple of different ways to carve that up. I'm going to add my cost center parameter in here. Again, I have 2 of them, so I want to make sure I select that MB cost center. Oh, maybe I thought I had cost center. Maybe not. This is my first cost center, apparently. Or maybe I didn't have a space in my original one. Now that our cost center is added, you'll notice that no options are here. So if we go over to our sales parameter environment, and I think I already have this should be enabled on my custom server blueprint. Let's see. Sales parameters. We can see now, here's my cost center. Notice we have all 3 values available here. So all 3 values available for cost center here, because I did not constrain them at the environment level. Now what we can do is we can go back over to our environment though, and we can say, maybe for my sales parameters environment, I only want to allow 2 cost centers from my global options as values. What's interesting is I can't now that I've created global options, I don't think it will let me do this at the environment level, but let's find out. Apparently I lied. Let's see if this actually works though. So in this case, I think the behavior may have changed here. But let's refresh our custom server order form. We'll go back, select that environment, and we'll see if it lets us select that value and submit it. If that's the case, then I think maybe that was a bug at some point where that was constrained. So notice no selection here because my cost center, it was only a single value on a mandatory field. So yeah, it looks like we can override that global parameter if we're setting different values at the environment level. You know what, now that I think about it, I think where that doesn't apply is if our global parameter options are set with a generated options plugin. So I'm not 100% on that. Maybe we'll uncover that later in the video. So from here, I should be able to submit. Let's just make sure it doesn't complain about my cost center value. Okay. And we should be able to now that this is created, we'll give the server just a second to show up here, the server object. And then once it shows up, we should see that value on the server already, even though the server doesn't even have a name at this point. No, maybe it does. But now if we go to parameters, we can see it did take that cost center of 0000. So we can now take that value and do something with it down the road. That could be an orchestration action that reaches out and does something inside of our environment. The other handy thing that I'll just point out real quick, when we're working with parameters inside of CloudBolt, those parameter values, one of the use cases we talked about in the intro slides was the ability to tag that parameter value to the resource on the cloud endpoint, whether it's vCenter, AWS, Azure. We're able to take that value that was set, and we can set up tags inside of our resource handler. So I'm just going to set this up real quick. Each of your resource handlers should have this tags tab available. You can go to add tag, and I'm going to say, I'm just going to search for it. MB, there's my namespace coming into play. Now I can select MB Call Center, and then my tag name, this is what it's going to show as in vCenter. So in vCenter, I want to make sure that this matches a tag category that I want it to show as. So you could put spaces in there. I'm going to do it with no spaces. I'm going to do it camel case. This really depends on your tagging standardization, but this allows me to drive how I want this to show inside of my vCenter and to standardize this. And if we're using the same cost center parameter across all of our environments, now that one parameter that we've set up allows us to set global constraints across all of our cloud accounts. And by doing this tagging standardization, we know that cost center will always be a 6-digit number, regardless of where we've submitted it. So let's go ahead and add this tag. Now, when I build new resources in this vCenter, we know that it's going to pull that MB cost center parameter. By the way, parameters are actually referred to as 3 different things depending on where you're looking at them in CloudBolt. One would be parameters when we go to our parameters tab or add them to environments. 2 would be attributes, and attributes in CloudBolt are really, they're just parameters that are used in a different context. You may also see these referred to as custom fields if you start to do things with automation and do things in the database with parameters. But just keep that in mind. They're typically interchangeable, but they're all referring to parameters, whether it's attributes or custom fields. So now that we've set this up, when we build new resources here, and we can also set this to be bidirectional or not bidirectional. And what that means is if the cost center changes in vCenter, if it's bidirectional, we're actually going to update that value in CloudBolt as well, which is really handy. If your tags change, you have some other automated process that updates those tags, it can synchronize that value back into CloudBolt so that that cost center is reflected appropriately in both places, regardless of where the change has been made. Okay, so parameter values here. Let's talk about, so they can be set at the environment level. So we've set up some options at the environment level. And I'm curious, I don't think I'm going to go down that road, but I think you can set constraints here as well. So maybe a specific environment, maybe this environment only needs a 5-character cost center for whatever reason. Anyway, I think that's better set for our use case to be global in nature. So we can set parameter values on the environment itself. So let's go back and set another value here. It's going to be one single value. Now we can also set cost center. Now, if we set this on the environment, this is saying that anytime I deploy for this environment, and this environment can be controlled, who can access it? In this case, only my IT group can get to this environment. So because we know that only IT can get to it, we can add the IT cost center in here. But maybe we also have, if we come over to my groups tab, we can also add parameters to a group. And cost centers are really good. When we think about a cost center, this is a really good example for the group-based parameters would be this idea of a cost center. Every one of your groups typically are organized, at least for most customers, in a way that are specific to the group itself. So usually when we talk about cost center, that's an accounting code that allows us to tie bills to a specific group inside of our organization. So if we're looking at cost center, there's my cost center parameter. I'm going to add this to my group as well. So when we look at this in a minute, we're going to have a parameter that's set at my group. We're also going to have the same exact parameter set on our environment. I'm using this to talk about propagation in CloudBolt. I'm going to put a completely different option in here. Oh, that's not going to work. For cost center code. So I have a single value for cost center on my environment, a single value on my group. Let's just see what happens when we go to the catalog to order this, because when we go in CloudBolt to order a resource from the catalog, there's a number of filtering and propagation that happens to come up with the final form that the end user is going to see. So if you notice, we go to this environment, you'll notice we have an option, a drop down now, where cost center is 2 options. It took a marriage of the group option and the environment option and showed both of them in the same drop down window for me here. So something to keep in mind here is if you have the same parameter set in multiple different places, in most cases, I think maybe even all cases, it's going to take a marriage of those 2 options. Remember, normally with a single option set on the environment, it's not even going to show the parameter because it's a static value that we've set for that environment. I will also say that if we switch environments now to my sales environment instead of my sales parameters environment, Notice that input goes away here. We're no longer seeing the cost center. However, I know because I'm submitting a request from my IT group that I will get that single value added to my cost center for any environment in CloudBolt now. So the power of setting a cost center at the group or multiple cost centers, maybe you have a group that has access to 2 or 3 different charge codes. You can set all of those options for the group at the group level. They can then select the applicable charge code for the workload that they're provisioning from that dropdown. But when you set these options at the group level, it's always going to add that option to any request that the group submits. So there are certain cases that these types of values are really, really powerful. So something to keep in mind there. We can also set 2 other places that parameters can be set. I'm going to go back and just select a different blueprint. I think this Jenkins blueprint's okay example for this. In CloudBolt, there are a couple of tabs that don't show up. This parameters tab, discovery management teardown, I think a couple of others don't actually show up in CloudBolt for something like our custom server blueprint. So custom server is what we would consider a standalone server blueprint. We can have other blueprints that also do standalone servers, but notice we have a lot less tabs here. And the reason being is that we do not have a resource type defined for this blueprint. When we define a resource, it opens up more tabs. That gives us the ability to do what we call XaaS inside of CloudBolt, anything as a service, where we can define not just how to build the thing, but also discover, manage, and tear down that resource. So you can define CloudBolt plugins to handle all of these actions here. This also gives you the ability to add parameters that are then tied to our resource, so that when we create this now, the end user is going to see, let's go back to cost center again. But we have our cost center parameter. We're going to add it to our Jenkins blueprint. That will now be prompted to input a cost center here. We also have some inputs, I believe, from the build tab that will be prompted to select. But this now, these parameters, we can set this as a destination, or a destination for each of these parameters here. So this isn't available when it's just a server parameter that was set on an environment. But destination, when we think about this, when we're building a resource, this parameter is a little more global because we may have multiple objects inside of this blueprint. Maybe there are multiple server tiers, and each of those server tiers should have the same cost center tied to their server. We can set it at this blueprint parameter, and this will now propagate down to all of the resources provisioned, if it is at least set to all build items or both. You could also set a parameter value on a blueprint parameter to apply to just the resource. And what that does is we'll create an object in the CloudBolt database where maybe then our cost center applies to the deployed resource. Usually both is sufficient for really any use case, unless you want to prevent this from propagating down to either the resource or all build items. Then you would select the opposite. So I'm going to leave this as both for now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put another option in here. Again, it has to be numeric. So we now have another option now on this blueprint. And if we go back to order my Jenkins blueprint, what we should see is at the blueprint level, after we select our group, this is going to take, again, a marriage. And I don't think... I actually think I stand corrected. I believe that our blueprint parameters, let me just make sure I did this correctly. I'm going to add another option here, just close, but not quite the same. Just to be sure I understand this. Back to my IT group. Okay, so we do only see the 2 options when it's a blueprint parameter. The blueprint parameter options override parameters set in other places, even from the group, which I find interesting. I may talk to product about that, because I think this should be uniform across the platform. So I'll see if I can engage those discussions. So something good to know and to find out. The big point here is we can set parameters at the blueprint level. Those can then propagate down to other components inside of the blueprint. And then finally, we could also set parameters on a user account as well. So if we come over to my user profile, we could set values. Maybe it's, in this case, this is something I'm building for a Git management ZUI, where I've stored a token for my user so that each user, when they commit their commits, they're always committing based off of their own tokens, their own accounts. We don't have to worry about a service account, which is really interesting. I actually just discovered this recently. So we can set these parameter values on the user object as well, and those should be able to be used in context. So that's kind of it for parameter propagation. Those are kind of the four main places we can set them: environments, groups, users, and blueprint level parameters. So that's kind of, a lot of really usable places to place them. I would say that most often if we're building servers, they're usually set at the environment level. If we're building non-server types, they're set at the blueprint level, or the most common use cases that I see. But group is also handy for some specific use cases, as well as user when it's a value that should be specific to an individual user account. So yeah, a lot of good usable information. Actually, the other thing I'll point out from a user perspective, we've had a number of customers that programmatically set values at the user profile level. One of them might be like max servers that a user can order. And maybe Michael Bombard gets 10 servers they can order, but Joe Smith gets 50 servers they can order. Then as we go through the provisioning process, we can check against each user profile and say, sorry, Mike, you can't provision this 11th server. You've already hit your quota. So we would cut off provisioning for Mike, but not for Joe at 11 servers, because his user profile specified that he should get a larger number. So again, just a couple of different ways to use parameters, talk through propagation, different places they can be set so far. All right, so we're going to get into some more of the programmatic aspect to parameters inside of CloudBolt. So I have an idea. Again, we're back to our cost center use case. We're going to use this as the ground works for the ability to go out and query, let's say ServiceNow is actually what I'm going to build an integration to ServiceNow. This is going to be a real quick and dirty integration. It's not going to be anything that's quite production ready, but it should give you some of the idea of the flexibility when we're building these things out. So I'm going to first clear my options that I set earlier for my cost center parameter. I'm then going to this programmatically generated options selection here. I can add an action, and it automatically gives it a name called generate options for cost center. It then creates an example workflow here that gives you a basic idea of how to return options for this. So why don't we talk about this a little bit? I use this quite a bit. So notice this get options list is our insertion point here, as opposed to the run method that we use in a lot of other places in CloudBolt. For generated options, it's going to end up being get options list. So there is a lot of documentation around how to do these things. Notice in this example, if I leave this return here, I'm just going to see a list of those numbers there. I do want to get rid of this. Now, one of the handy things, one of the reasons that I will use this get options list function for things where maybe I'm not even talking to an external system, but you noticed earlier we passed in those values. What happens if I want to give that value a label? So maybe we have a couple of integers that we want to. Actually, these are not going to be integers. Remember, we're storing our value as a string, so I want to be sure to pass that correctly. Just 3 made-up numbers. Now, I could say maybe this is for a project, I don't know, project awesome group IT or IT group, things like this. You know, maybe these pertain to separate projects, telephony project, those kinds of things. Anyway, what ends up happening when we set up an options list like this? What this is a list defined in Python. A list is like an array in other languages. It's a grouping of different options that we want to pass back. And what we're doing here in CloudBolt, we're passing into this list It is a list of what we call tuples in Python. Tuples are ordered lists, so these are still a list inside of these parentheses. But what happens is, while this list can be reorganized and changed, in a tuple, this position never changes. And when we're doing get options list, if we're passing a list of tuples in the options that we're returning, we can say that we can give it the value should always be on the left-hand side, and the label should always be on the right-hand side of this tuple. So when we go to select this, this is going to now, I'm going to save code here. I'm going to go back over to my catalog to show you what this looks like. I may need to clear my group value. Actually, this is a good test here. Remember, I said earlier your group values can only, your other values, your environment group values can't go outside of the bounds of what's set globally. So let's see if it lets me. Yeah, so notice now that this may still allow me to keep this here, but notice I have these three options now, and it's no longer the number for the cost center. I can select an applicable project. And then what happens, because the user's given a more user-friendly label for this value, I'm able to present that to them in the UI. And then on the back end, we're gonna capture the number as the value that we're storing. So just really handy. I'm gonna clear this value from the group so that we're not seeing any collision between the two. But once I do let my group save, go back to my group, now I can go to my parameters environment again, and we should see. Let's refresh this again. You know what? I think on my the challenge here, I think my environment, I still have a value set. Let's go to my parameters environment. Yeah, so I need to clear this. Notice when this needs to be an option that exists in here for it to show in the dropdown. Since it isn't part of that generated options, you can't do both. It has to be one or the other. So now that we've cleared that, let's refresh our page. Let's go to my IT group again. Let's select the sales parameters environment. And now we see that selection of those three values that we can select from a dropdown. And just to prove that I'm not making stuff up, let's go ahead and submit this for November 19th. That's way too far out. I'll forget to delete that. I'm a sales engineer. I need to delete it tomorrow. Let's submit this request. This is now going to go out and build. Once that server object is created in the database, we should see the parameter. There we go. Server object exists. Let's jump on over there, take a look at our parameter. There we go. Our cost center is the numerical value or the numerical string. Looks like a number, but it's really a string that we stored based off of them selecting, I don't even remember what I selected at this point, Project Awesome. So we can now use this when we go and build this server in vCenter. It's going to have a tag that matches this value. So I'll actually keep this tab up. Just want to show that end. I know we showed the tagging creation or setup process earlier. We'll go back to that here in just a minute. So that's one thing that I like to show when we're looking at generated options is just very basic. How do we do value label returns? And that's kind of a start to working with generated options. The next thing that I'll point out here, notice that we're returning a dictionary object here. I don't know if you recall, but before I deleted that first option, it was just returning a list. And we absolutely can return just the list. However, when we return a dictionary, that really opens up a plethora of different things that we can do in CloudBolt. And I'll point you at this advanced option returns documentation to talk through that. So you'll notice that we can, when we're talking about those option returns from a generated option plugin, you can return a list of simple values. That was that first one where it was just a square brackets around a couple of numbers. We can also return a list of two tuples. That means that the value layer, the value, comma, label return that we just looked at, or we can return a dictionary that includes a combination of different things. So initial value would be the way that we set a default in CloudBolt. So if we wanted to, if you recall, when we went to select the value for the server here in CloudBolt, I just want to see if this is up and running yet at this point. Yeah, so we can see, let's tie the loop on this real quick. Let's take a look at my 012 server in our vCenter. So just I want to tie the put a nice pretty bow on top of the tagging portion here. But if we go over to 0.12, earlier in the video, we talked and set up those tags. It didn't quite work the first time. But if we now go over to our 0.12 server, we go to our summary, we can see that we have our tags. If I can find them, where are my tags? Oh, there they are. Didn't go down far enough. See, notice here again, tagging standardization is extremely important, especially when you look at the public cloud. Notice we created a new tagging category of vCenter. This didn't exist beforehand, called Cost Center, and we tied a value of that value that we selected here. So automating things like tags, making sure that they're standardized, controlled, and governed in the endpoints that we're attempting to automate. Also, the description for created by CloudBolt is kind of handy, just in the context of vCenter. Anyway, now that that's done, so back over to our options list. If you recall, the drop down for Cost Center before was empty. You had to select a value, I believe. Let's validate that just to be sure I'm telling the truth. And if not, we'll talk about that. Yeah. So it automatically selects the first option here. There's a couple of options there, though. Why don't we talk about that first, and then we'll talk about a default value. So Project Awesome, because it's the first one in the list, is always going to be the default in this particular instance. But we might want to force them to make a selection. The easiest way that I found to do that in CloudBolt is to create another tuple, and I can put it can be at the top, it can be, actually, let's show you this, because it doesn't matter whether it's at the top or bottom, that really, it just doesn't matter. Because I lied. You want it to be at the top in the case that we're doing here before we add that initial value in. But what we're going to do is on the left-hand side of the equation, we want an empty string. What that's going to tell the system is this is an unselectable value by the end user. So what I usually do in this is I'll do maybe like 6 dashes, and I'll do please select a cost center. And then end it with another 6 dashes. I can then save this code. We can go back over to the catalog and we'll see what that looks like. Wrong group. Okay, back to our parameters environment. I did not like that. Let's make sure. Yep, there's the problem. I did not create a list here, so syntax would get you every time. I prefer to do a lot of this in my integrated development environment. However, just for a real quick demo, this usually serves some purpose. My IDE catches all of the syntax errors that I make, and as long as I'm paying attention, it usually saves me some pain. Let's make sure this captured it correctly. Tuple, so value, label. We do have the comment in here, so this is now a valid list. Let's try one more time. It may not have had time to refresh with the database. There we go. Yeah, I think that was the case. Because we have this label here, that may override my default value. But notice now they're forced to select from the dropdown. Let's just make that change real quick. I didn't realize that was the case, so we're all learning here, right? Let's go back to parameters admin. We're going to go to cost center. And what I'm going to do is get rid of that kind of ghosted field, my placeholder. I think placeholder overrides a placeholder that I'm effectively, that's what I'm doing with that. I'm returning a blank value, is I was returning my own placeholder by returning that empty value as the first one in the tuple. We can go back over here, just refresh this. IT group, select my parameters environment. And now what we should see is the more usable message. So that's a way to programmatically add a placeholder in here. I guess we could have also typed that please select a cost center in as our placeholder when we go to do that generated options plugin. I like to keep all of that in code though. That way, if we're shifting between environments, it's capturing all of that. We don't have to worry about setting those things inside of the UI. But once we then go through and select a cost center, then we can submit this request. Notice right now, if I tried to submit this request, I can't because there's a required field that has not had a value selected for it. So that's kind of a handy little trick when we're doing generated options plugins. The next thing that I'll point out, and I think I already closed my tab. I'm going to pause for a second and pull that back up. So here's our advanced option returns documentation. Some of these are, you can read through this, makes it a little more usable. I'm going to use this initial value though. So remember, Project Awesome was our original initial value, but I'm going to pass in a different initial value, and I believe it just needs to be the number. So instead of Project Awesome, I'm going to tell it that my initial value should be, and it should be the value portion, I believe. I'm not 100%. We'll find out here in just a second. But I'm going to get rid of this selected cost center because if I have that placeholder value in there, it's not going to allow me to do this initial value. So if we have something that we always want to be the default, then the user can select something different if they want to. This is a good way to do that. So let's go back over to custom server. Hopefully it's refreshed in time, so we're not doing it twice again. And let's see, project telephony is now my default. So notice my third option is now the default option. So a lot of things we can do before we even start to talk to any kind of REST API with CloudBolt. So the next thing that I want to do is kind of start working with ServiceNow. I want to show just how to do a real quick REST query to an external system to pull in a similar list. So I'm going to go over, and I just discovered before I started recording this that there is a cost center table in ServiceNow that exists. I have done nothing with this, so you're going to get to see me kind of work through this, troubleshoot this process, and figure out how to get this working. So first of all, the cost center table in ServiceNow, I'm going to go over and take a look at that table and see what's available to me. So there's a couple of columns that are, there's a whole bunch of columns that are available. But maybe account number is something that we want to store our cost center code in, and then maybe name. So I don't need to do a lot of these other fields, but we're going to do something similar where we present the name, we're going to let them select the account number. So I'm just going to maybe create a record that does those two. Access controls, let's see, there is. I'm going to show a list of existing cost center. You know what? There's already a couple of them out there already. I may remove some of my constraints. I'm just going to use these out of the box ones where we notice we have account number ACN 0001. Again, we're looking for a string, so maybe without the constraints, these will work. But we're going to submit a REST call that returns a list of these groups, these account codes, or the name of these account codes, these cost centers, with the corresponding account number. So this is a really interesting example. Going to make a REST call to ServiceNow. I already have some of this information available inside of my CloudBolt system. I mentioned earlier, this is just going to be a real quick way to do this. I'm not going to build this out the way that I would for production. In production, I would probably use connection information or connection infos in CloudBolt that allow me to store credentials for this system. I'm just going to show how to do this real quick inside of the script. But the first thing that I'm going to do, and this is probably the only thing I'll do in my IDD today, is I'm going to start using Shell Plus. I do have a ServiceNow example, and I want to use this mainly to build up my URL. But in Shell Plus, I'm going to go ahead and capture the information for my authentication, and we'll use this to build out the way that we're doing this inside of my CloudBolt generated options plugin that we're working with. So I'm going to validate in Shell Plus. I have another video that covers through Shell Plus in depth. So, but Shell Plus is an invaluable resource for validating things in CloudBolt. I'm not going to go super deep into that because there's already a video that covers it. Okay, so let's go ahead. So I'm going to start by building this out. Let's do, again, I'm going to steal some of my code to build this out. We're going to make this even easier when we get into that. But my base URL is really just going to be my ServiceNow URL. And I can go over and I can say, here's my ServiceNow URL. And I'm going to store this as URL equals, and create an F string just in case I need to. I may not need to though. tables API. I don't know that I need a query here. I think you can constrain like the number of results being returned, those kinds of things. There's only a limited number of tables. So we're not going to go deep into the ServiceNow API, but I do need to get the information from that specific table. So I need the name of the table. It's not cost centers. It's going to be CMN cost center. So there's my table name. Now this should be a suitable URL to call. Now the only thing we need to do is get the authentication information. So I know that, let's do this. I have this stored already, so I'm just going to take what I already have. Service account. Okay, so there is a service account there. There's the name for the service account. I'm not going to print the password because you don't need to know that. But what I can do now, because I have these variables, I can import my request module. So REST calls in Python, request works really good, super easy to use. I'm going to import requests, and then I'm just going to copy this entire line here. And what this is going to do is I have a variable called con, so I'll get my service account, my password from there. My headers are included, and then the URL I'm going to pass in to get a response. So let's see if we get a response. Hopefully this is as easy as I think it's going to be. Perfect. So response, and then we're going to do that JSON. Love it when a plan comes together. So now we have this JSON, and we can see that this is may not be a list. I don't think it's a list. It's a dictionary with a list inside the dictionary. Yeah, so result, we need to go to my result, and then we can do parse through the list to get the, I believe it was, yeah, account number. And then I believe name's probably going to be the other one. There you go, name and account number. So let's do this. We'll do, and then it was result. Just make sure it doesn't scream at me. Yeah, so that means it works. So let's do for result in result. We're going to print. We do an F string, and then F string we're going to do result. Account underscore number. Actually, I'm going to flip that around a little bit. Close everything off there. Make sure I have things in the wrong place here. There we go. We have our square brackets, our curly brackets, our print. Curious why these are brown still. Did I not close something? Oh, you know what? I do need to close this inside of the quotes. That's why. So there's my account number. So I can also do result name. Actually, I'm going to do this as a tuple here in a minute, but I'm going to put a colon between those two. So this should print the name and account number of everything. There we go. Super simple, right? So the way that we would format this for CloudBolt, though, is going to be slightly different. Let's do, there we go. I'm going to pull PyCharm over to another window and copy and paste into what I'm doing in CloudBolt. Let's do, okay. So we're going to reach out to ServiceNow. This also gives me an opportunity to talk about CloudBolt parameters when it refers to what did I call it in the introduction? Action inputs. So this, at its base value, this get options list, this generate options for cost center CloudBolt plugin is a templated Python module. So I don't have any templates in here yet, but because we reside on the Django web framework, you can use a Django template to put or place parameters into this that also use parameters, but these parameters are not globally defined. They're localized to the scripts that we're working with. So first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to pass in something called, I'm going to call it, let's do username equals, and I'm just going to put it in quotes. And then I'm going to put double curly brackets around it and do username and the double curly bracket. And that's going to allow, this is going to tell when I save this, it's going to create an input for this action up above. So now we have the username is going to be captured, and then we need the password. And I'll show you what I'm doing here. I don't want the user to see a clear text password, so I'll show you how to mask that from the end user. And then maybe we also do base URL because we want to make this a little more portable. Maybe one environment we have a development instance of ServiceNow, and another environment we have a production instance. This would allow me anywhere I use this generated options plugin to define what those options are. So we'll talk about that as we get into this. So we have those three things. Actually, why don't we save this real quick? Now that we've saved it, you see my variables show up here, my action inputs. This is where these are parameters in CloudBolt. They're just localized to the script that we're working with. So I don't necessarily need to namespace these. It reads what we're showing over here in the double curly brackets, and it will render this template at the time of execution. So the next thing that I'm going to do is the base URL. I'm going to come in. This is probably fine. Let's make it a string. I can put regex around it to make sure that it's an HTTPS:// but I'm not super concerned about that today. What I really want to do, though, is change this password field from a basic string to make this be a password. I also want to, one of the other valuable things to do with this for generated options is we can hide a form from a user when a default value is set. That way, if we're ever using this CloudBolt plugin in a blueprint request, we're not going to prompt the user to put in a password if the password's already set. So this has to be selected for an action input for it to be hidden if a default is set, versus if we have a single value set in other means with a global parameter in CloudBolt, this is not an option. So just remember, if you want to hide this input from the user, just make sure this field is selected. I don't care because this is being run as what we call an orchestration action. So I can get to the action here in just a minute. I'll head over there. But I'm going to set these as defaults for this orchestration action here in just a minute for my environment. Anyway, we're then going to take actually, I'm going to do this a little different. Because these are at the top of my script, these should be global there. No, nope, you know what? I'm fine because I'm inside of a method, the get options list method. This is perfectly fine. So I can leave those as all lowercase. So now I have variables that are set. Then I'm going to do, I need to build out my URL. So let's do URL equals, and get over to my other screen, see if I can capture my URL. Now we could also do this with, we could also template the table that's getting passed in here, where we're telling it what table we're pulling these from, and what's handy. Actually, let's do that. Because I am a huge fan of making things reusable across the CloudBolt ecosystem. And what this now affords me the option to do is I have a generate options for cost center plugin here, but I can reuse this plugin for other ServiceNow tables now by making this extensible. The challenge, I'm not going to have the same fields like what are they called? Name and the other one, account number, for all of these tables. So maybe this isn't a good use case. I'm just going to do it anyway because I think it's a good representative use case. But maybe another input here would be a list of, or just a list or a dictionary entry that says what values do we need to pull from this table, and we can actually take and pass that information in so that as we're building our list below, we can pull that from the variable that was set. That allows us to be a little more dynamic. I'm not going to go into that in this one. We're just going to leave this table as an input. I am going to go ahead and do my base URL here. And not double curly brackets, just a single curly bracket because this is an F string, not a Django template. So the F string is going to pull this and build this string out dynamically based off of my base URL and my table value. And then I'm going to copy and paste my REST call that we did. If I can find it in my console over here. clean. And I want to knock them all back. Oh, that's not helpful. There we go. Okay, apparently. Gotta get that single space like that. Okay, so now everything's kind of aligned. Python's touchy about alignment here. Notice con service account, we have this. We have username and password. I'm just going to replace this with my variables from above. So my username and password variables. We're pulling those in from the context where this is set. So now we should have a response. The other thing I'm going to do before I forget is I have to import requests, or it will complain. It doesn't like when you don't have a module that you're referencing down below here. So now we have our response, and now what we need to do is for, just going to pull up my syntax here, result and response JSON result, we can say, let's create our options. We're going to create an empty list here. Then we're going to do options.append. And then we're going to append that tuple that we want it to be. So I don't think the extra set of parentheses is needed here. I think it's extra, but I like to keep it for tuples just because. But we're going to do result. And remember, the value has to be on the left-hand side. So we want the count number. And then we need, on the right-hand side, we need result name. And that should give us, now we've built out an options list so that when we go to return options, I'm not going to do an initial value here. Now, the other thing I will do in this use case is I like to insert that placeholder in here. So a lot of times I'll build out, actually, you know what I'll do is my first option here, I'll just include this as an empty, this is going to be my tuple, so empty, and then please select cost center 3, 4, 5, 6. There we go. So now this is going to be the first object in the list. Then we're going to pass in additional tuples as we build out the list from the result from ServiceNow. So let's save. Hopefully this works on the first try. Again, my IDE is usually a little more foolproof when I'm doing these things, when I mess up syntax and things along those lines. So let's see how this goes. Let's go back over to order custom server. Okay, it is saved. Refresh. Should be available by now. Oh, you know what I didn't do? Last thing, I do need to set my defaults here because I don't know what base URL, table, password, or username is going to be. So I'm going to go over to my plugin, and I think I may need to search for this when I get there. We'll see what happens. Yeah, it's just all orchestration actions. So once this loads, I'm going to search for cost center. Oh, never mind. Takes you to generated parameter options. Should be the very last one because it's the last one that I've done in my environment. There we go. Notice there's a red exclamation point here. And that is because it's going to fail until required inputs have been assigned default values. So orchestration actions, in CloudBolt, we have the base CloudBolt plugin, which is what we just edited. That's the Python module. But that's then used and reused in different contexts. So we have this orchestration action now where I can come in and I can say default value for base URL. I can go over to my, don't want that slash because I'm putting the slash in my plugin. So there's my base URL. Nope, I didn't want the slash. And then password, notice, oh, that's not right. We'll get that fixed. I thought I set that as password already. That could be, this should be masked if it's a password field. Let's see if it lets me save. It's not going to let me save. Go back over to my plugin. So a couple of ways we can get there. I could just go to all of our actions and then navigate, but if I go to my cost center, I can link back to my plugin directly from the cost center parameter itself. So password, I meant to set this to password. I didn't. So there you go. That would explain it. Okay, so now this is a password type. So unfortunately, we're going to have to cancel out of this. I may need to even refresh the page to see. There we go. Now it's typing it as a password. So I do want to mask that. Let's go ahead and paste our base URL. The name for the table, again, was CMN Cost Center. The default value for username was SEMO. And then the password was okay, so we should have enough information now. All of our defaults are set. So this is where I mean make it reusable. I can set the same value on a different orchestration action that generates a different list of options for a completely different parameter inside of CloudBolt. So our cost center orchestration action's now been saved. I should be able to refresh my custom server blueprint now and be able to see that information is now being pulled into my form directly from ServiceNow. Of course, valid URL 0, table 0. Well, that's not helpful. It doesn't like that for some reason. I don't understand why. So invalid URL 0, table 0, let's kind of go through the troubleshooting process for this. First, I want to look at the action again. Make sure that my F string is built appropriately. Base URL equals base URL. So that should be getting set, assuming that these defaults work. They should work there. Let me refresh this because the password field, I don't think that's been updated yet. Yeah, this is seeing it as a password. So this is the latest version. Very interesting. So we're going to go through the process to troubleshoot this a little bit. I'm going to start by doing, I'm going to start, and let's use this to talk about logging a little bit in CloudBolt. We have this kind of helper method where you can do from utilities.logger import thread logger. You can then set the logger globally for your scripts by just invoking a new thread logger class object. You can give it some intelligent information like this. I believe this will show in the logs if it's like threaded correctly. So this is now, maybe it's ServiceNow generate options instead of what the other one said. Now what I can do though is I can actually log out my URL. So I'm going to do a logger.debug. I like to, we also have set progress in CloudBolt. I try and keep the set progress entries light to only what an end user needs to see, like server is now cloning in vCenter, server is now rebooting, things like that. But anything that has to do with like anything that an administrator who's trying to troubleshoot a failed job cares about, I'm going to do is either debug or info kind of log events. So logger.debug, I am going to print out, this is going to be an F string. I'm going to say URL equals URL. So that's going to print out my URL. I also do want to print out, I want to make sure that I am capturing these. So I'm going to print out all three of everything except for my password. So I want to make sure that we have these variables getting templated in here appropriately. And hopefully this is just an instance of maybe the plugin wasn't saved and I wasn't ready or anything. But now we have a couple of log entries that should, we want to see that the base URL in the table exists because the entry we were showing, I don't know why it pulled in 0. That didn't make sense at all. But anyway, I'm going to save code here. So have a couple of print log entries here. I then want to go back over to my orchestration actions. So just going to refresh again real quick. Then I'm going to pull up my cost center orchestration action just to be sure those defaults are saved and they took. There we go. Check my defaults. Okay, there are still values in there, so I'm not even going to save anything. So my defaults are all set. My plugin should be good to go, at least for additional. Let me go all the way back to the catalog and come back in just in case. I don't think it's an issue, but never know. Watch it work this time because I didn't refresh. Okay, so same thing. So now I'm going to get over into a little bit more of the logging aspect of CloudBolt. Let's go to, I'm going to run it. Hold on just a second. Clear my console. So logging in CloudBolt, I'm in my CloudBolt appliance. I can do a tail-f on var log CloudBolt application.log, and I should see that log instance. Notice it's still showing the zeros there. Again, not sure how 0 is getting in there, but let's see what we're seeing. So that's why 0 is getting in there. It's username, base URL, and table are all set to 0. So I'm not exactly sure why this is happening, but it is. So, wondering if there's something that I missed. Actually, you know what? I said I wasn't going to do this. I'm going to go down the road to set this up to call this information from a connection info, which is just it's a better way to do this. So versus having all of this here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to say connection info name equals. That way, we have multiple connection infos inside of the CloudBolt system. This allows us to specify a specific connection, and most implementations of CloudBolt are going to have multiple connection infos in the system. Why don't we go ahead and set this up then? I can also use most of the things we do in CloudBolt, like we have connection infos, but we also have an ITSM plugin. So if you're using the ITSM manager, it is also a connection info. You just don't see them here. But I'm going to create a new one for my instance here real quick. And I'm going to call this just ServiceNow, real quick and easy. I'm going to paste in my URL here. So there's my IP/hostname. Port, I don't really care about. Protocol, I am going to care about because I'm going to use it. Username is going to be SEDemo, and then my password, not that password suggestion. I'm going to pull that real quick. Okay, so I have my password object now. You could do other things. A lot of times, like if I have multiple ServiceNow connections in my environment, I might label them all as service_now or something like that. That allows me to organize multiple connection infos that all are serving a similar purpose together. But I don't really care about that. I'm not going to use auth headers in this scenario. So that's really all I need. Username, password, IP, so that we can create this URL and build it on the fly. Now that that's created, what we will do is we'll go out to our Shell Plus again, and we'll just validate what this looks like. But what we can do is we can build a base URL, and the base URL is going to simply be, let's do connection info objects.get, and we're going to do name equals ServiceNow. Let's see if that works. All right, we got our connection info. So we can say connection info equals, it's stored, so we can see like username is stored there. We can get to that from there. We can do ci.ip. There's our URL. We can do ci.protocol, I believe, and just tab that out. HTTPS and password CI, I'm not going to print it, but there's our password as well. So we can get to all the information we need for our plugin directly from that connection info. The other thing that I will show in Shell Plus, I don't know what the import is for this offhand. So a lot of times I'll do connection info, and I want to see inside of my imports when we launch Shell Plus, I can search and notice it's giving me where it's imported from. So I'm going to start by capturing the connection info object, the import. I'm going to paste that up at the top before I forget. Okay, so now we're importing that connection info object, and then we're going to do connection info name equals ServiceNow. And then let's just do con equals connection info dot objects dot get name equals con info name. That should get us to our connection info object. Username is then going to be con.username, and we can just leave all of this to swap out what we had here as variabilized to call it directly from the connection info. Password. Base URL is going to be a little different. This is actually going to be an F string where we do con.protocol ://con.ip. And what's really cool is we can actually take this and validate this in Shell Plus. Let's do con equals CI just to set that. But let's store this as base underscore URL. That's exactly what it should look like. So we're constructing our base URL on the fly. Table, I'm just going to set this statically because I don't. So we can set this once again. I prefer the variables, but I wasn't sure what was going on with the orchestration action defaults, and I don't really have time to troubleshoot that right now. So now we have our URL, we have our logger. This should do the trick. Let's go ahead and save that. Give it a second. It should be in the database now. Go back over to our catalog. Go to order custom server. IT group. Select our environment. Hey, look at that. Now, select a cost center. These are all values being pulled in directly from ServiceNow. Let's see, the one question I had is, since it's not meeting the constraints, I think it will still work, but let's see. It may choke when we go to submit this because it's that, yeah, so the cost center must be, remember we have the constraints on this parameter that are, so let's go over to cost center, our parameter itself, remove those constraints, because even though we're generating options, they still need to match the constraints that we've set against this. So I'm going to remove those constraints just because we're now driving those values with ServiceNow. Since ServiceNow is our source of truth, I'm comfortable removing that from the constraints that we're working with. And there's my cost center. So let's try this one more time. Let's do maybe IT to match our group. You could also just, you could pull in the group in the context and query ServiceNow to get the corresponding group and pass it in as a single value here. There's a lot of flexibility there. There we go. Let's just verify that we're getting that. I think it was AMN number, ARN, something along those lines. We'll see what value is set on our server. There we go, ACN. So that's the value pulled directly from ServiceNow. It's now set as a parameter value on our server object. So the last two things that we have on our agenda are really talking about parameters or parameter values on the server and resource objects themselves. In this case, when we see this value here, this means that there's a parameter value tied to this server. This can be used in the context of an orchestration action. And in an orchestration action, it's really easy to reference this. I'm actually going to get this server. Why don't we do this? Just show what this looks like. But 23545. So I can go into my Shell Plus and I can set my server as server.objects.get ID equals 23545. We now have that server. And now I can do MB underscore cost center. And we can access that value inside of any of our orchestration actions. we can use it. So again, this cost center probably, this is usually more centered around tagging purposes, but we can reference those for servers and or resource objects and use them inside of automation. We can pass this data to an external system. It's extremely powerful as far as what this does. We could check to see if a server has this value set or this a value for this parameter set on it. And if it does, then we did do a certain automation, but if it doesn't, maybe we just pass right over it. So a lot of flexibility built into the way that we're able to handle those things in CloudBolt. Parameters, again, at their base value, they are fields of metadata, things that we want to capture from the end user about these resources. This concludes another video in the How Do I Do Something in CloudBolt series. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Thanks for sticking around for the entire thing. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to your account team. We'd be happy to dive into any of these topics a little bit further. If you have ideas for additional videos that you'd like to see in this series, please let us know. We're always looking for new ideas and things to cover to help you in your automation journey. So thanks again, and happy automating with CloudBolt.